Where do I begin to tell the stories of the ethical dilemmas I've been in? Here's just a little story. Once upon a time, I was a political advisor. I was working in a state government organisation who was introducing some new sex education materials for young people in school from years 8 to 12. So that's 13 to 18-year-olds. The new material was going to be including all sorts of information about condoms, sexual practices, sexual preferences. And there was a giant outcry from a very small group that had a very loud voice. And they wrote letters, they sent messages, they paid advertising. The Premier at the time in my state got more letters about sex education than any other document or issue ever in the history of the state. I became known within the government circles as the woman about sex education. The Minister wanted to work out a way to make sure that the voices of all the disappointed parents out there who didn't like the new program could be heard. And so we came up with this idea that the parents could opt in to letting their kids take this class rather than opting out, which was the old way. So they were able to tick a box to say yes, their kids could take the course. As it happened, my prediction was that 98 to 100% of parents would tick the box because really they did want it. And all these angry parents who really didn't even have their kids in the state schools would disappear and get out of the way. And they certainly did. And it was a great outcome. And the thing I was really proud about was that for the next 3 years, the abortion rate in my state went down because kids were better informed. But the ethical dilemma part of it was how could I inform and support the political process and letting these voices be heard that couldn't be heard because they had to raise them so loudly and they were frustrated. And so the technique that I used was to try and find ways to enable those loud voices to be heard through community access directly to the Minister at community meetings. It was just exhausting. I was glad it was over, but internally it's really hard to be faithful to what you want to make happen, to make a safer place for young people and for them to grow up, but also to abide by what you believe in is what is a democratic process.
So, how do you get people to buy into ethics? Why should they actually care? How do you get them involved? Why even think about it? I was asked how I use IAP2's ethics, and I have to admit, I use it to actually start a process. And I engage people, whether it's my clients, whether it's my internal stakeholders, whoever it is, and I ask them to actually read it. Do you believe this? Do you actually believe what you're reading? Can you commit to what you're reading? Because quite frankly, if you can't, maybe this is not a good fit for you. Maybe we shouldn't be moving forward together as I think we should be moving forward together. But if you are, remember that this is a long-term process. We're going to be doing it throughout the whole consultation project that we're working on. So I can do that with my internal stakeholders, and I can do it with my clients, and I can do it with some of the decision makers and others. But I have to admit, you just asked me the question on how do I do it with external stakeholders. And I think probably the way I bring ethics out to the public is through meeting expectations. What can people hope to get from the process that we're developing? And how does it change? So I can come out with meeting expectations, but I also want to be open to, does that reflect what you want from the process and how you want to become engaged? And so that we can actually continue to build that together. But having the ethics documents it speaks to my values, it speaks to what I want to get out of a process, but it also really helps me learn about what do you value and what do you want to get out of a process. Do things go wrong? Yeah, they do. I have to admit, they do go wrong. And some of the areas that I've had, and I guess the big one that I would want to pull out on is that I can often get my client and my internal stakeholders to come along, and very often, fabulously, and yay, I get the external participants involved as well. But decision makers, sometimes it's really hard to bring them to the table. They have so many competing priorities, they have so many competing interests, and sometimes they'll buy in at the beginning, but something else has happened, something with the budget process, and they can no longer move forward and do what they want to do. So Where do I have issues? It's actually in the final decision. It's not in the process, but it's actually taking all of this hard work that so many of us have been involved in, we've ethically contributed to it, and then we've brought it forward, and sometimes it stops, or it drops, or it's no longer there. And so my heartache sometimes is within the decision-making process, but my excitement is that we absolutely have something that we can use and take out and share with others.
For me personally, it's coming to it from a place of genuine intent. So the line in the sand is that if there really is no opportunity for people to have influence at whatever scope or whatever level you're setting, then we really shouldn't be doing it at all. Certainly, working in government, sometimes there's a lot of decisions that have already been made before you get to the table, and public engagement sometimes comes too late. And I think for me that's a big ethical problem, but I also think it's something that's changing. I think there's a real willingness now not to sort of cover the table in expert reports before you go to the table, before you go to the community, but to bring them out early in the process so that even framing the question goes to community input. So it's not just sort of this is the decision to be made, but sort of what's the question we're actually looking at? What are we trying to decide to begin with?
Congratulations for even wanting to explore ethics in public participation, because unfortunately to date it's not a subject that we seem to be well read on when it comes to P2. And unfortunately what happens is that most practitioners feel at liberty perhaps of practicing P2 the way they see most fit. So unfortunately, because there are no standardization across the board, because there's no standardization across provinces or across countries even, we're at liberty of defining what those processes look like. And I think when it comes to evaluation, it becomes extremely important to design your process to meet a specific objective. And probably one of the elements, as elementary as it may sound, one of the most difficult elements for decision makers to articulate, to overcome, is to be able to explain exactly what change they hope to effect through a process. We seem to be a place in public participation in Canada right now where as long as we can check it off the box, it's like a job well done. As long as people say they enjoyed the tea and coffee and as a whole they were very pleased with the session, we pat ourselves on the back and we move on. But essentially, when we look at the cost of these processes, we need to be able to tie what we're doing to basically outcomes. One of the greatest challenges, I guess, that I face, ethically speaking, is making sure that all these key decision makers do not shy away from the importance of being clear from the onset what they want to change, that their processes are also very representative of the population we hope to affect the change in or with, and that we have some clearly defined outcomes. And sometimes we shy away from those outcomes as well, because how do you measure it? We barely have enough monies in our budget to support the public engagement processes. How do we supply all that research capacity to prove that we actually affected change? In health, what I often recommend is not reinventing the wheel, not necessarily looking at even the establishment of new indicators as much as what are the indicators that are currently in the system that are widely acceptable across the board. One that I would suggest becomes very valuable when you're speaking to key decision makers. A lot of these decision makers are responsible ultimately not only for the health of the population, but for defending their budgets and for doing what they do with less money from year to year. So if you can go to them in a public participation proposal and you can grab their attention by well-established indicators and show them that the outcome of your process will hopefully impact the indicators that they too need to affect, I think you have a greater buy-in. And also tying back to the ethical question, I think that it allows you, or it increases the accountability of the process to the people that it's supposed to affect the change with. So ethics and representativeness basically go hand in hand.
Hey there everybody, I'm Bob Joseph. I have a company called Indigenous Corporate Training, and I'm here to talk to you about capacity funding agreements and working with First Nations and sort of the ethical side of things. The big challenge for communities is they don't actually get money from Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada to work with organizations outside of the community. And so to actually meet with mining companies, forest companies, health organizations, or anybody else for that matter, they don't get money to do that. So they actually have to find a way to get the money, otherwise they literally take it from housing and education and programs like that. So one of the things I try to encourage people to do is to think about capacity funding agreements when it comes to working with First Nations and paying for their participation in any kind of meaningful engagement and consultative process. So that could be anything from elders honorariums to per diems to funding legal analysis or scientific data research. I would encourage you to do it. I think it would be really helpful for the communities and definitely ethical from my perspective. So good luck working with the communities.
So the work that I do is with Aboriginal communities in Canada, and I work with communities across our nation from coast to coast to coast. And for me, ethical engagement is really about building trust and building relationships and meeting people where they're at. And so when a couple of examples of where ethics has come into play for me are working in communities where my priorities are 100% different from the priorities of the people that I'm working with. And so I have no frame of reference. I don't know what it's like to have a history of intergenerational trauma. I don't know what it's like to have 4 kids by the time I'm 22. I don't know what it's like to be a grandmother who's afraid of having nice things in her home because her son might come and steal them for drug money. I don't know what it's like to be oppressed by a government, so I don't know those things. And for me, ethical engagement means trying to hear that story and bring that story into my processes and to be there with the person in their experience as they tell it and have a heart to listen, have the compassion to understand, and have those communities members and those communities as a whole have that voice in the process in the way that makes sense for them. And that's what's really important to me about ethics in public engagement. Thanks.
I think I learned in one of the very first projects that I was ever engaged in that establishing two-way communication with the public and stakeholders involved in the project was going to be really important. We were asking for feedback from them on what questions they might have that should be considered through a process. We were asking them for feedback on what information they wanted to hear, and in return they expected from me and from the project team the same responsiveness and the same commitment to sharing new information, to being forthcoming about how we were going to use their information. So I think one of the key things I've learned, and that's shaped how I engage with the public on behalf of clients or what have you, is establishing two-way communication right off the top and building expectations around that. It creates context for honesty and transparency, which is, to me, a key part of ethical practice.
I think for me, ethics is so fundamental to what we do, to helping people participate in public processes, that I ask myself, what would my mother think of what I'm doing right now? What would my grandmother say about what we're about to do? Is it the right thing to do? Seems like a very basic premise, but I think it requires that foundation, first of all, but then also just that inward reflection to ask yourself, do I truly believe that this is the right thing to do? Knowing the objectives and the communities, the people that I'm dealing with, am I treating people fairly? The most obvious example is in terms of to what extent some of our clients believe in doing meaningful Aboriginal engagement or Aboriginal consultation. There is such a history there. A lot of people don't understand sort of the issues or the background. It means that we should all take a step back and try to understand where everyone's coming from, so that we can sort of move forward on that. And I see that all the time, especially in terms of First Nations communities, Aboriginal communities.